Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Madison, and I'll be the technical manager for this session today on generating demand for healthy diets, practical lessons from private sector marketing, chaired by Shaneka Thurman. So thank you all so much for taking part in ANH 2022. We're really looking forward to a robust and interactive session today. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Shaneka. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining the session today. We're really excited to both share with you and to also learn from you best practices related to generating demand for healthy diets. As Julia mentioned, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box where you're joining from. If you're working for an organization, if you're in school, we'd love to know who is sharing our virtual space today. So before we start, I think it's important to make sure that we all understand exactly what we mean when we say demand generation or generating demand for healthy diets. From our perspective, demand generation is a data-driven marketing strategy that's focused on driving awareness of and interest in safe and nutritious foods. And the ultimate goal for us is improving nutrition outcomes. Demand generation uses research to bring consumer perspectives to the forefront of the consumer's point of view. And we also then use what we learn from the consumers to market to them appropriately. And today we'll be sharing more about best practices in demand generation, specifically insight identification. Okay, so this learning lab will be very interactive, and we invite you to participate in any way that you feel appropriate. We will start by having a poll. So we've shared our perspective of what demand generation is. We want to know what yours is. So in another tab or on your phone, please enter mentimeter.com and you'll see the code that you should enter at the top. So we'd love to hear from you. We shared our perspective of what demand generation is. When you hear demand generation, what comes to mind for you? There are no wrong answers, so feel free to share whatever comes to mind. Okay, I see a few things coming in. Advertising, incentives, marketing, behavior, interesting, business, triggering, encouraging purchasing, changing habits, aspiration. This is super. I see in the chat, consumer preference, taste, desire to eat, fantastic. Buying and selling, a few more coming in. Communication, public health, profit generation, cultural norms, changing habits. These are great. Okay. So thank you all. It's great to know what comes to mind for you all when we hear demand generation. So I would like to present my colleague, Amelia Giancarlo, who will introduce our session leaders and share how we'll spend our time together today. Amelia, over to you.
Thanks, Shaneka, and thanks everyone for your participation in the poll. I really liked seeing those answers, and it should be really interesting to see how those answers change at the end of the session. So I'm going to quickly present to you our speakers for the day. We're so lucky to be in the presence of a really diverse group of speakers today, ranging from our colleagues at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security within the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. We have Ingrid Weiss and Kwamel Hanks with us today. And we're also joined by several colleagues who've implemented projects with the demand generation component, including Mercy Gibran from the Bangladesh Nutrition Activity, Lisa Sherburn representing the former Nourish project in Cambodia, as well as several colleagues representing the Fish Innovation Lab Smaki Salama project out of Kenya, including Ivy Blackmore, Elizabeth Mao, Laura Ayanati, and Andrew Wamakoto. And so finally, from the USAID Advancing Nutrition side, we have Shanika Thurman and myself. My name is Amelia Giancarlo. I'm going to present just a quick kind of agenda for what we're going to do today in the session. As Shanika mentioned, we're hoping that it'll be really engaging and interactive and give you a chance to actively participate. So we'll start by providing a bit of background information on our demand generation work that we've been doing on the project, as well as why USAID sees this area of nutrition programming as such a priority. We'll then hone in on one section of demand generation for healthy diets, as Shanika mentioned, which is the development, identification, and strengthening of insights, which are a critical component of strategic marketing campaigns. And then we'll have a brief introduction from each of our case study presenters before we head out into breakout rooms, in which we will all have the chance to practice ourselves identifying and strengthening insights in real-world examples from each of our case studies. Then we'll finally come back together and we'll hear about the insights that we discussed in the breakout rooms, and we'll have a wrap up and any final thoughts, followed by a brief Q&A session. So I'll now pass it back to Shanika to get the party started.
Okay, so we again are so thankful that you're joining from all over the world. We recognize that for some of you, it's quite early. For others, it's getting pretty late, but for everyone, I think it's a good time to launch a dance party. Why not? And we want to do this in an effort to illustrate what demand generation could actually look like in practice. So I would invite you to join us on this dance party, and then we will debrief about our party in a second.
Okay, great, thanks.
Very good for you and me. Little girls can get some more iron. And my ladies get some more iron. Make we do the no green steps. Oh yeah, do the no green steps. Oh yeah, make we do the no steps. Oh yeah, stare it, crumble. No, toss it, stare it, crumble. No, toss it, make we stare it. Oh yeah, toss it, make we crumble some. No, any kind of green leaf where you put in your pot, make it carry, knock you, make you put them on top, Stir it up together. Now it's rich in flavor. Now you get the kind thing where go make you the strong. Little girls can get some more iron. And my ladies get some more iron. Make we do the no green steps. Oh yeah, do the no green steps. Oh yeah, make we do the no steps. Oh yeah, toss it, crumble. No, toss it, stare it, crumble. No, toss it, make we stare it. Oh yeah, toss it, make we crumble some. No. Oh yeah, toss it, stare it, easy now. Make we open it and crumble now. Even if they're like diamonds and iron. No, oh yeah, toss it, stare it, crumble. No, toss it, stare it, crumble. No, yeah, toss it, make we stare it. Oh yeah, toss it, make we crumble some. No,
So I would love to hear more from you. In the chat, feel free to tell us, one, if you were dancing, I'd love to know. And two, what elements of this demand generation effort may have made it successful? What made it interesting? What drew you in to this video? Sharon was tossing and stirring. Excellent. The beat. Okay. It was easy to remember. Toss it and stir it. Excellent. Very colorful. African cuisine. Wow. Okay. A catchy song, fun music, good lyrics, bright colors, appealing food and lifestyle. Finally, it got me. I danced, of course. A great vibe, delicious food, fantastic. Yes, it evokes a sense of good times. Eat this food and you'll have a life like this. I love that, Joe. Okay, definitely keep it coming. I just wanted to share a little bit about why we think this is a successful way to start the discussion. So this effort was actually attached to a randomized control trial. And we learned that through this demand generation effort, there was an increased consumption of green leafy vegetables that were added to the stew, which is one of the key messages that you may have heard in the middle of your tossing and stirring and dancing behind your computer screens. And there was also an increase of consumption of iron fortified cubes. And that was another message that was shared in this video. We also learned that this intervention positively influenced awareness of anemia and the determinants of behaviors in the town where this video was focused. And we didn't see much of a difference in the towns where there was no influence. So again, I ask, why might this have been a success? And I love the answers that you're sharing in the chat. And I think a few elements that really come out quite strongly is their ability to really touch the heart and open the mind, which is really a key characteristic of strong demand generation. It definitely communicates a benefit. It 100% delights the audience, which is why I really love Joe's comment at the end. If you eat food like this, this is kind of the life that you get. So it really draws you in and delights the audience. And you can tell that whoever developed this had a really good understanding of who might be watching it, right? They understood what would draw us in. And it hinges on an insight. And that's something that makes people feel like this is for them. Makes them feel seen, it makes them feel heard, and it makes them say, aha, and it inspires behavior change. And at USAID Advancing Nutrition, we have been working to prepare USAID's partners to use similar social and commercial marketing or demand generation best practices. And I'll turn now to Kwamel Hanks to share a little bit more about USAID's demand generation priorities and how we're working together to improve the quality of this work and to see more efforts like the ones that you saw on your screen just now.
Thanks, Shanika, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. So my name is Kwamel Hanks, and I'm a nutrition advisor in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And so I support the RFS investment in USAID Advancing Nutrition. And we are really excited about this work on building consumer demand for healthy diets. So within RFS, my team's focus is on improving diets, where we want safe and nutritious food to be affordable, accessible, and desirable to the communities we serve. So we've been working closely with Advancing Nutrition on the desirability piece of that sentence. Consumers are key actors in the food system and what they want to eat, why they want to eat it, and how they want to eat it is really a critical piece of the puzzle that we need to put together to sustainably improve diet. And we all know that telling people what to do and what's good for them doesn't usually work. And we just know that too much telling in general is usually pretty ineffective. So we are attempting to build more rigor into our approaches to demand generation. One of the ways we can do that is to pull out the evidence-based best practices from private sector marketing that are applicable to our work. So this guide that we have anchored this learning lab around is intended to do just that. The guide will help users better understand how to design demand generation efforts, to monitor progress, to learn from implementation and acquire data, and to adapt marketing efforts accordingly. So we will start testing the draft guide this fall and hope to finalize it shortly after. And we will use today's session to share some key elements. So that's all for me. I'm excited for this session, and I'll hand it back over to Shanika.
So as Cromwell mentioned, we have worked to develop a demand generation guide, which the session will share elements of. The element of demand generation that we'd like to focus on today is called insights. So let's go back to the Mentimeter, and I'd love to hear from you this time. What comes to mind when you hear the word insights? Knowledge, information, relevant details, inside info, I love it. Perspectives, data, futuristic, intelligence, guide. Excellent. All of the things that you mentioned are true. They are all examples of how you get to an insight, what an insight is, and how you might use them. So essentially, insights are revelations that are drawn from audience research, and it helps us understand how we might inspire the audience or the project team or a creative agency to think or feel differently. But how do we get there? How do we know which insights should be used? How do we know if they're good? How do we know if they're appropriate? And how do we know if they'll work? All successful demand generation work begins with a keen understanding of the people that you'd like to focus on and the behaviors that you want them to adopt. Those people could be caregivers of children under a certain age group. They could be fathers, they could be religious leaders, and behaviors or any specific action that you want them to perform could be feeding their child an animal source food every day.
Open that window.
Or it could be purchasing food every day. And this often means that you do have to do formative research. I saw in the Mentimeter qualitative, I saw research, and that was spot on. You often have to do formative research to really understand your audience. And you have to know specifically about the people and what makes it easier or more difficult for them to practice the behaviors that you want to promote. And also, who can support them in practicing that behavior. So to do this, there are a few areas of inquiry that we would suggest you explore. And they're broken into 3 sub areas of inquiry here. So on the left, you see what the audience is willing to do related to the behaviors that you want to promote. In the middle, why is it that they can or cannot currently practice the behavior? Are there internal factors, social factors, structural factors that influence their ability to practice the behavior? And finally, how? How can you reach them? Is it through influencers? Is it through supporting actors? What information channels might you use? Maybe that's radio or religious groups. And finally, is it possible to reach them through their aspirations and motivations? Okay, so you've selected your areas of inquiry, and now we start collecting data. And you have all the data that you need, and suddenly you have so many data points from your formative research. What now? It's really important to dig deeper. You're not quite done yet. You've not arrived at an insight. It's very common for practitioners to use the data that they've collected quite literally and not dig deep to look for the thing that might hook the audience. And we're suggesting that it's super critical to dig deeper and make meaning of the data in order to find an insight. And that would lead you to the aha moment that Amelia will talk about now.
Yeah, so insights in marketing are all about that aha moment that Shanika just mentioned. So when it comes to a campaign, you do have two potential pathways that you could do: a simple messaging approach, or you could take this approach with insights that digs a bit deeper. A simple messaging approach states a benefit and assumes that knowing that benefit will be enough to change someone's behavior. So an example of this would be telling community members that green leafy vegetables are good for them and they should eat them. This information alone, though, will probably not change the audience's behavior. So marketing campaigns, like the ones that we're talking about here, often require the audience to change its perspective, and therefore they require what we're referring to as an insight. So insights can really come from anywhere. So we know that it's a revelation that's drawn from audience research that wants to inspire the audience to think and feel differently. They can come from a barrier, for example, that mothers might lack authority to implement changes in the household. That's a barrier that an insight could stem from. And insights can stem from opportunities, such as community members feel optimistic about the future. Or a fact that adolescent girls need 50% more iron versus when they were younger. So in each of these examples, insights are rooted in something that the audience cares really deeply about, and they represent something the audience maybe did not know or previously had not thought about in the same way. But it's important here that we remember that insights are not necessarily all about knowledge barriers. They're more about digging deeper past surface level information about your audience's lives to really understand and tap into what matters to them in order to get them to notice your campaign and thus change their behavior for the better. So that kind of leads me to these 5 criteria that you can use to determine if you have identified a strong insight from your audience formative research. And these are kind of questions that you can ask yourself. Does my insight have tension? And we'll dig more into what these mean in the next slide. Is this insight true, but not necessarily obvious? Does my insight strike an emotional chord or response within my primary audience? Does my insight inspire my audience to think or feel differently? And finally, will my insight be easy for my project team to understand, use, and remember? So in order to demonstrate exactly what we mean by insights and what we mean by these criteria, and to see what they look like in practice, we wanted to look at a quick example. So here we have the insight that was actually behind the Nor Food Fortification Toss It Stir It campaign that we saw earlier in the session. The insight is that mothers want their teenage daughters to be happy and successful, but they don't realize that their daughters likely suffer from iron deficiency anemia, that anemia affects their daughters' ability to concentrate and focus, and finally that their daughters need 50% more iron now that they're adolescents than when they were younger. I want to highlight that the most important part of this insight is what's bolded, that mothers want their teenage daughters to be happy and successful. And the team identified some knowledge gaps that served as barriers to this success and happiness. But the important part of this insight is this bit at the end of the day, that happiness and success is what is important to the primary audience. So we can break down this insight now to see if it fulfills our 5 criteria we talked about. So does this insight have tension? It does. In this particular example, the tension comes from the fact that what might be hindering the adolescent girl's happiness and success is this sometimes invisible ailment of anemia. And second, is it true but not obvious? Perhaps it's obvious to mothers that their daughters are unhappy or they might not be as successful as they could be. And audience members might even know that their daughter lacks iron or is anemic. However, it could be that audience members have not connected these two facts that they know about their daughters, kind of resulting in that aha moment that we talked about earlier. So this insight, thirdly, does strike an emotional response, as mothers want more than anything for their girls to be happy and successful. And finding out or connecting that iron deficiency is connected to their children's happiness and success would be alarming, and it would get at something about which they're passionate. And then in turn, kind of going on to the fourth criteria, that alarm and that emotional response is turned into action. This insight will inspire the primary audience to think and feel differently about the importance of iron, since it's so tied to their daughter's happiness and success. And finally, a way to make this an easy insight for the project team to use and remember is using that 50% number. So 50% of the girls in the zone of interest suffer from iron deficiency, and adolescent girls need 50% more iron now versus when they were younger. Now I know that was a lot of information, but I'm gonna pass it now to our first case study presenters from the Fish Innovation Lab of Samaki Salama to give you an example of what we're talking about from their case study in Kenya. I hand it off to you, Ivy.
Hi, yeah. Excited to be here with everyone and share a little bit more about sort of the formative work that went into developing the Samaki Salama intervention. So this was a project that was focused on nutrition, social marketing, as well as a combined fisheries ecosystem sustainable fisheries project. So trying to better understand challenges that families have in coastal Kenya in terms of accessing quality diets and increasing their consumption of fish, but also understanding constraints as well. So the primary audience for this work was caregivers with children under 5. So in this area of coastal Kenya, in the formative research that we conducted, a large percentage of these children were stunted, and so there was a real deficiency in terms of diets and sort of wash issues. We're focused on promoting fish consumption due to the strong evidence on fish helping addressing stunting issues. Some of the primary elements that we developed out of the formative research was, and this is tied to the social marketing campaign, was cooking demonstrations, home visits by nutrition educators, so going door to door to the intervention household, workshops with the fishers. So something that came out of the formative research was that the fishers, the fathers, were very interested in learning more about sort of nutrition issues and how to help support their children. And also we distributed materials to health workers. And so the primary behaviors that we were promoting were trying to encourage caregivers to feed fish to young children on a daily basis. Caregivers feed an age-appropriate diverse diet, including fish to children 6 months to 5 years, and increasing sort of washing hands and using soap, and also encouraging fathers to reserve and take home a small portion of fish for their child each day. So the primary objective was to determine the effects of multi-tiered social marketing campaign that I mentioned, to promote fish nutrition, dietary diversity, and food safety for children to improve the stunting challenge for children.
Thank you so much, Ivy, for sharing about Samaki Salama. And we're going to have, some of us will have a chance to learn a little bit more about this particular case study in the breakout rooms. But for now, we're going to pass it over to Lisa Sherburne, and she'll tell us about the Nourish project in Cambodia.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all. This project ended. It was from 2014 for 6 years, but it's another example of promoting fish to young children. So I'm really excited to have fish play a major role in this session. And there was a broader umbrella social and behavior change communication campaign called Grow Together that linked 15 priority behaviors, but we'll really focus in right now on the social marketing efforts around fish powder made from small rice field fish. The primary audience of the marketing campaign was rural mothers and fathers of children 6 to 23 months old. The demand generation activities included branding and promotion of a product, which was just simply roasted powder made from the small indigenous fish, sold through market vendors in informal markets and through social media, and later on through Tupperware type parties by the entrepreneurs who set up a party in their neighbor's house with the community health worker, and different women came and brought vegetables or other things they were growing, so they exchanged, and it was another selling point and a fun way to get the fish powder into mom's hands. There were also village fairs where community volunteers cooked with the fish powder in the traditional soup so that everybody could taste it and make it together. And there were also some taste tests because it was sold through the informal markets, but it could also be made at home for caregivers who wanted to do that. So specifically, the behavior being promoted was a diverse diet for children 6 to 23 months, with a special emphasis on the 9 to 11 months old age range, because that's where growth was faltering and there was a real serious lack of animal source food consumption during that particular period of time. The demand generation objectives then were to create demand for practices, services, and products, including this small fish powder, and to use the private sector to expand the supply of products, including this small fish powder. Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for sharing about Nourish. And yeah, so I also love that we have kind of a fish theme running through today. I'm going to now pass it to Mercy, who is going to be sharing with us about her activity at the Bangladesh Nutrition Activity.
So I will be presenting on the non-fish case study for this presentation. So Bangladesh Nutrition Activity, we are also a Feed the Future project working in Bangladesh, and our target is to improve nutrition in women and adolescents in rural households in Bangladesh. We work across 3 districts in Bangladesh and in over 700 villages in the country. We intervene using market systems approach as well as behavior change approach. And from our formative research, we realized that dietary diversity, while it was high, certain food items were quite low. So consumption of green leafy vegetables, legumes, eggs, and orange flesh fruits were quite low on the dietary diversity scale for the country. So those were the key food items that those are the key food items that our project is promoting. Our primary audience are children under 5, pregnant and lactating women, adolescents, and generally women of childbearing age. From our formative research, we realized our demand generation objective basically is to improve the consumption of these promoted foods in the households. And we're doing this in a number of ways. One of the challenges we realize is that most women do not access the market. So women do not go to the markets, it's the men that purchase the food. So sometimes, even though women want to cook the nutritious, the green leafy vegetables or the legumes, they might not have access to that. So one of the things that we did was to create a network of female sales agents who are able to take these food items to the doorsteps of the households and sell it to the women in their households or in smaller markets in the communities that the women are able to access. We're also working with religious leaders to promote these messages to the men, especially since the men are the ones who access the market. So they promote the messages in the mosques, in the churches, and in the temples. We're also intervening directly with adolescents by promoting nutrition behaviors through school clubs and adolescent clubs. And then we're empowering the adolescents to become change agents and leaders in their communities as well, so that they can promote these behaviors with their parents and among their peers. Our priority promoted behaviors related to demand generation is that the men will buy nutritious foods in the market and women cook nutritious foods in the households. Thank you very much. We will be discussing more about this and the insights in the breakout rooms. Thanks, and back to you, Amelia.
Thank you, Mercy. Thank you so much. And we really love to hear just this little snippet, little teaser about all of your case studies, because we will be now kind of split up, and some of us will be able to hear more in depth about these case studies. So the idea is that the ANH folks will assign us, kind of split us evenly 3 ways between each of these case studies, and we'll go into a breakout room. And the presenters will share a little bit more about their project, go a little bit more in depth. They are open to any of the questions that you might have about what they specifically are doing or were doing in their activity. And they're also going to share a small kind of at a glance snapshot of their formative research, so that the participants can practice creating and identifying insights from that formative research. So something similar to the insight example that I shared about mothers wanting their teenage daughters to be happy and successful, and that being related to anemia and iron deficiency. So something along those lines. So feel free to get creative with it and toss things out there, have a discussion about it. And then you can also, we've also kind of set up these slides so that you'll have a chance to also use those 5 criteria to answer the questions that we went through about whether or not the insight is as strong as it could be. So we have quite a bit of time to explore creating and identifying insights. And yeah, I will stop talking and let everybody kind of make their way into a breakout room. Thanks, Julia. And thank you everyone for your participation in the breakout rooms. 30 minutes goes really quickly when you're in those. So I hope everyone had a chance to think about some insights and hear a little bit more about these really interesting and robust case studies that we have represented here today. We'd love to hear from someone from each breakout room who's willing to share a little bit about what you talked about. Maybe I'll hand it to the Nourish group first.
Oh, well, Vivian, do you mind giving a recap?
I can go ahead. So maybe Amelia, you can go to our slide. It was quite interesting. So we picked 2 insights to work with, and one of them was children wanted, and because it was surprising, it was an insight that children want the small fish powder, and so we analyzed that, and we realized that it doesn't really have a strong tension. It doesn't really have a strong tension, but if we combine it with growth, then that will have a stronger resonation. And on the other criteria, it is true but not obvious. We also figured that it really depends on the familiarity of your kid with the small fish powder, and does it strike an emotional response. So it also depends on the cultural norms of what providing for the kids mean. So for example, for me, I came from an Asian household, and if children want it, that sounds like, children just want toys, and it doesn't really necessarily strike an emotional response. But for example, with Ingrid, she would think, if my kid wants it and I provide it, I'm a good parent. So it really depends on the cultural norms, and does it inspire the audience to think or feel differently? We linked back to that it needs to be combined with growth, and it needs to raise awareness of what could be lacking from the diet, the nutrition component. So at the end, we kind of concluded that children want it. It's kind of like a weak insight that that we can definitely strengthen it in these 5 criteria. So in the next example, which is the previous slide, we use convenient food to have a healthy, happy family, indicating the small fish powder. And in that example, we had quite a few fun discussions. So does it have tension? So we explored the question of urgency. Does this insight sound like it has urgency? Is convenient resonating with the audience? Because putting in time and effort can be seen as a valuable character for caregivers. And so when we go to the next criteria, it is true but not obvious. We think, oh, it is kind of true that healthy food can be convenient, could be surprising. Like it's not very obvious. But Steph from our breakout room group mentioned that, oh, convenient can be linked to ultra processed foods, and that we sparked like a mini conversation about should we change the wording of convenient, and Ingrid said we should reclaim it. We should reclaim convenient to healthy food, and we all vouch for it. So yes, this is a mission now. We're on the set to reclaim convenient to healthy food. And does it strike an emotional response? Obviously, yes. Healthy, happy family, huge yes. And then 30 minutes cut us off. But it's definitely a stronger insight when we start combining these elements together. And it was just overall a really fun exercise to do.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And your group got really far.
Oh,
Now noticing, yeah, really wonderful the way you got through 2 insights and were able to use these questions to kind of evaluate the strength of it. So in our group with Samaki Salama, we kind of noticed the same thing, that when we started to combine insights, they became stronger. But maybe Ivy, do you mind sharing a little bit about what we talked about? And I can put our slides up as well.
Yeah, so we got to the bullet point stage. I took a little bit of time going into some more project details. Yeah, one of the kind of key insights coming out of it was how sort of gender roles within the community are not necessarily as rigid as, you know, someone from the outside might think they are. And so, you know, highlighting again the importance of really talking with people and understanding where they're at and what they're excited and motivated about. So for example, the fathers were really actually very interested in learning more about nutrition. You know, they wanted cooking classes, demonstrations for themselves so that they could, you know, jointly then talk with their partner or spouse back at home and have a more comprehensive understanding of how important, you know, a diverse diet and fish is and for their children. And also, you know, the fact that there's these, they're called mama karanga. These are female fish sellers that play an important role in sort of local fish access. And, you know, maybe they're outside of the traditional role of the caregiver at home, but you know, they are playing a key part of local access to fish. So, you know, really taking the time to understand, you know, we may think of people as being in certain categories, but it's more fluid than that. The idea around sort of fish broth and understanding why there was across different stakeholder groups, caregivers, fathers, even, you know, local health workers, this belief that fish broth was, you know, what children should be receiving versus the meat. And, you know, part of that was, you know, fear about fish bones. So how do we talk with caregivers and about how to prepare fish so they feel more comfortable feeding the fish meat to the child, and sort of addressing some of those concerns. Another component is sort of the economic aspect of it. You know, fishermen tending to sell their catch versus bringing it home, partly because they need the income and partly because, you know, they didn't actually realize how important it could be. And, you know, the caregivers complaining, well, my husband never brings any fish home. And then, you know, as the fishermen get this information, they realize, oh, wow, this is really important. I should try, even if it's not, I can bring some of this less important fish home and sell the better the fish that where I can get a better price. So, the opportunity to frame fish as sort of a treat for the child, as a father providing for their family, as a way to kind of reinforce this message the fathers about the importance of bringing fish home.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and I think that also, the note about fathers, but also these more flexible gender roles, is kind of, you can find a little bit of tension in there. And it might not be necessarily obvious that they would really benefit, maybe perhaps more, in bringing home those fish than selling them for monetary income. Like there's a little bit of different types of value with the same product. So thanks so much for sharing, and thanks to the group for being so participatory. We do have one more group from BNA, if you are willing to share a little bit about what you talked about.
So I will say that speaking on behalf of the group, this is a very hard exercise to do in 30 minutes. We barely scratched the surface, but I think we got some really important insights. And I think, like other groups, I think they started to become stronger when we started combining those insights. And a lot of our insights were actually focused on insights for the implementer or the practitioner. So insights can be for the person practicing the behavior, or for the practitioner, or even for the creative agency. And a lot of the things that came out were for us as practitioners. So I will pass to Hillary to share a little bit more, and then others, please do feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Shanika. So our insight ideas from the formative research, one of the big things came about was the foods that are purchased are often purchased by the head of the household, so often the male in the household, and the women are doing the cooking. So the foods that are purchased are not actually discussed with the cook. So the cook actually has not much power and decision making about what they're cooking, because it's what gets purchased for them. Also, a big insight was about taste was really important. That came out through the formative research. And this, what we're saying, is not normally focused on by practitioners, but also the importance of taste, not for just the purchase of the food or head of the household, but also for the children. So the taste was very important for the children as well. One of the things that was noticed, I think this was from Shelley, was that the affordability didn't seem to be a constraint that was listed in this formative research. And often I think that is the one thing that often comes out, and we almost expect it to come out with the formative research, but this actually wasn't included. Variety is important, and a big thing about, we're focusing on a few things, but actually for this group, that the variety was important to them, and this also links with the tastes, and that we normally focus on women. So this was a big thing about a lot of our work within health promotion and behavior change, is that we're focusing on women, but actually within this group, the men are the ones that should be targeting, especially as they are making the decision of what to purchase, and therefore what the family are going to eat. Another thing that was brought up was about what goes really well with something else. So the accompanying foods and preferences, so not just the foods on their own. And finally, it was about the quality. So the people who were purchasing the food often did look for quality and looked for things like pests, etc., on the food. So it was also about engaging with the market holders and what foods are being sold there. So from these 7 insights, we started to build the insights. So we got to 3 of these. So the one was that cooks have access to quality foods. Food can be easy to cook in a variety of ways, and to consider the household members' preference in food preparation. And from that, we started the next exercise, but I'm going to pass on to Shanika for this.
I wonder if anyone else in the group would like to share anything else that we may have missed in our presentation.
No, I think perhaps I can elaborate on, why we got to those three starting to build the insights, because these are compounded from the initial insight ideas. And, from the insights there, we noticed, there's a big, let's call it attention, that the people who purchase the food's different to the people who prepare it. So as you think on some of the interventions, it's almost as if somebody comes home with a mystery box of ingredients. So that's why we came up with the second one that says the food should be easy to cook in a variety of ways. And also it spoke to some of the things that we had inside some of the formative research that showed that the purchaser likes a variety of foods, not only in terms of purchasing, but in terms of what they like to eat every day. They come back to the market to get something different to eat. So that's why, and because variety is important, and the quality and availability and freshness of the food, we start combining these ideas to come up with, the cooks have access to quality foods. What are the different ways in which we can transform them? Because there's some motivation given for bearing the considerations of the rest of the household in mind. This is why the options are important.
Wow, thanks so much, Sherwin. Would anyone else like to share from the group quickly? If not, we will move on. Okay, so in our groups, we have had the opportunity to hear more about 3 nutrition activities through case studies. And we have reviewed the formative research ourselves to try to tease out what we think the insights should be. But I would love to pass it back to our case study leaders from Samaki Salama, Nourish, and the Bangladesh Nutrition Activity to tell us what are the insights? Which insights did you use? We'd love to learn if we were on the right track or if we were far off, or might you adjust your insights based on these conversations? So anyone from these 3 groups, please do feel free to share.
Yeah, I can share for Samaki Salama. Yeah, I think the insights were right on in terms of really focusing on thinking about the role of fathers within the household in terms of as providers and the person with the most access to resources to be able to influence sort of decision making around what food is brought into the home. And I think reflecting back on it, we had workshops for the fishermen where, it was a combination of information about these, focus more on fishing and these modified traps are provided, and we provided some nutrition information as well. But I think that's some aspect that we could have increased and amplified. Again, we're at the stage now where we're doing sort of the online data collection, sort of follow-up interviews with key stakeholders and fathers and caregivers about how the process went and feedback that they have. And something that the fathers keep mentioning is that, they wish they had cooking demonstrations also that they could participate in. So I think that's an area where we could have amplified and, thinking about sort of lessons learned for similar types of work. I think that's an area that could be expanded on, and how do we continue to be more sort of inclusive of the whole household and all the stakeholders within the household that can influence diets and decision making.
Lisa or Mercy, would you like to share what your actual insights were?
We were very on track, especially for the discussions that went on in the BNA group. I think we all narrowed down to the key things that factored in our decision making, which was that the women weren't the principal decision makers when it came to buying food. So one key behavior that we had to focus on then was to ensure that men were actually buying the right kinds of foods that we were promoting to the household. And since the women were the ones cooking the food, we also then targeted the women to cook the foods in healthy, nutritious ways for the household. So we were we used the two-pronged approach where we were targeting both the men who were buying the food as well as the women who were cooking the food. But we also had an opportunity where we could also take food items using the female sales agents who were like last mile delivery people who would take green leafy vegetables and fresh fruits to the households, and the women could buy them right at their doorstep. So even though women didn't have access to the bazaars to go and buy the foods, they still had opportunities to buy the food items right at their doorsteps, and still gave them that opportunity to still have access to healthy, nutritious meals in their households.
The insight that Nourish used was around the happy and healthy family. That resonated so deeply with the caregivers and the family members for this fish powder. But what I realized through the great discussion we had in the breakout group is that it was underneath this umbrella SBC communication campaign called Grow Together. And so it automatically could be linked in people's minds with healthy children growth, which is a core value and desire for parents. So even though the insight could definitely have been improved, I think because it was connected, it did have the intended effect. So I really appreciated that breakout group.
I would like to welcome Ingrid to share her reflections and close us out for the day.
Thanks, Shanika. And thank you all for this really excellent session and rich engagement. I had to join a little late, so I haven't had the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Ingrid Weiss. I'm a senior nutrition advisor in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And like Kwamel, have worked really closely with this team on evidence-based demand generation. A couple of points that really stood out to me in the session and in our discussion is that we gather data so that we can take an evidence-based approach to demand generation. We know that is the right thing to do. It's how we build rigor into our work. But it's so clear that using the data is just as important, or even perhaps more important than collecting it. This step about how to interpret the data and how to be thoughtful about what it's telling us, and to question the assumptions we bring in to humans as we look at what our formative research tells us, is really important. And listening to the case studies, it continues to reinforce how critical it is to understand your audience and the systems in which they live. And our understanding continues to grow. It's iterative. We never gather the formative research and say, aha, we understand everything, we're ready to go. So our hope is that we will all keep learning together. And as Kwamel shared at the beginning of the session, we are just about ready to test this generating demand for healthy diets guide. And so if you're interested in testing it, please do reach out to Advancing Nutrition colleagues, or if you have further thoughts on this type of work that you think would help us continue this conversation, please do be in touch and stay in touch. Thank you all very much for the session today.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for those closing comments. We did have one more Mentimeter that we would love, kind of in that vein, to hear from you about how your perspective and your ideas surrounding demand generation has changed or has developed since the beginning of the session. So if you'll go one more time to mentimeter.com and type in this code, we would love to hear from you in this way. And of course, as Ingrid said, our emails are open. We'll drop them in the chat, especially if you have interest in potentially working with us on this or any other questions or comments. Yeah, thank you for for joining. And I will switch over. I know there's been a little bit of, I've been playing a little bit of back and forth on my tabs here, but yes, it is iterative, isn't it? Yeah, it's a building block process. I really like that. And I think it's important to keep in mind when breaking down and really critically looking at formative research that as you're hearing from people through the research process, you know, your assumptions will be challenged and your ideas will change as it goes. So definitely the setup of this one is a little bit different from the others. Oh, I think I have to scroll. Sorry. So small pieces of information can lead to big insights. Yes, absolutely. Even pieces of information that you might think initially aren't that quote unquote important or have that much depth to them actually can, and they can lead to these really valuable insights. Yeah, certainly. Diverse team is needed to interpret data. Yeah, a variety of perspectives will be able to help you interpret your data in a myriad of ways, and you know, insights can be tweaked just the tiniest bit and make a huge difference and hit on different topics. Our assumptions are challenged. Yeah, you cannot rely on your prior knowledge or your own cultural biases. Lots of input are needed to understand and make progress. Yeah, it's really a group effort. And I think that we all saw that when we were working on insight generation in the breakout rooms. We needed all of those different voices to come together. We needed more than 30 minutes. So that's kind of a learning on our side, is that this is an in-depth process that might take a little bit extra time, but definitely needs that diverse group with lots of voices. And maybe this can be one of our last ones. It seems less top-down than some intervention approaches, and it centers community knowledge. I think that's a really, really strong observation. So thank you. And I think that's the goal, right? Is to center community knowledge, to put people in the driver's seat of their own interventions, because they can program for themselves, right? Communities know what they need, and they know what information can help, in this case, drive a marketing campaign for the better. And I suppose it'll be possible to watch what went on, not the same as participating, but hopefully. Yes, I do believe, Julia, if I'm not mistaken, the recording for this will be on the ANH website at some point next week.
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you again to all of our wonderful participants and speakers. It's been a real pleasure today to speak about demand generation and to hear from everybody. And a special thanks to our case study presenters. Really was a pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Thank you, everyone. We're gonna wrap up this session now, but thank you to all of our facilitators and speakers and presenters, and to all of you for all your questions and participation throughout the session. So yeah, please visit our website to see other sessions, learning labs going on later this week, as well as the research conference next week. And then, as Amelia said, the recording of this session will be on our website in the coming weeks. So thank you so much again, and have a good rest of your day.